Traps have been my least favorite part of the game for a very long time, but I had a complete eureka moment lately. And that eureka, this amazing revelation that completely changed the way that I run traps and made them into one of the best parts of my games. That eureka, I'll tell you at the end of the video, because in order for it to really make sense, I need to explain some stuff. So stick around. I'm done baiting you. This is how I made traps actually fun in DnD 5e. Not just okay. Part 1, why my traps sucked. So I've been playing this game for a long time, and I've been setting traps, copying traps, making up weird traps, but they never seemed to land with my players. They were a thing that they got through in order to get to the more fun stuff. And as a result, I kind of gave up on traps. I didn't kind of give up on traps, I completely gave up on traps. I started including them less and less and less in my games, and I stopped working on them. But I'm playing with some new dungeon masters recently, and a few of the campaigns that I'm running are headed into dungeons, so this forced and inspired me to revisit traps, and I had to face what I'd been doing wrong for so long. The first thing that was wrong with my traps was how they were encountered and discovered was inconsistent. Poor rolls or not enough passive perception led to this gotcha moment, or on the flip side, I would say too much or create too clear of a nod. Ahead of you is a spooky, but totally normal, dark hallway. It's ominous, though. It's definitely got some in it. I was ruining the effect in the setup, and the communication wasn't clear. Second, all of my traps went one of 3 ways. Either they didn't see the trap and they set it off and they all groaned, or they saw the trap and they spent an hour deliberating what to do about it, or if I was bored and low on time, they'd see the trap, they'd make a roll to disarm it, and then they'd either succeed or fail. None of these are fun gameplay loops. The first is punishing, the second is boring as hell, and the third is just rolling dice for the sake of rolling dice. So finally, the last piece of this puzzle is that I realized that my traps were just kinda lame. I was pulling traps from the Dungeon Master's Guide and splatting them into dungeons because I didn't know any better. So I had to teach myself how to do better. I started doing some research. I asked on a few Discords if any players really enjoyed traps and what those traps were. And the responses that I got fell into one of 3 categories. The first kind of response were players saying the cool ways that they had sidestepped or completely stuffed their DM's traps. The second response category were dungeon masters telling stories about their traps. That's not what I asked, but it still tells us a lot about how dungeon masters perceive traps. And finally, I had a few DMs saying that they were a good way to sap the resources of the party. And that last one makes me cringe pretty hard. It's also literally how the game is designed, to whittle down player resources so that you can get them to those intense tactical moments that we all know and love in combat, where it's do or die and the decisions that you make really matter. I think that this whittling down of resources is one of the weaker parts of the game, but it's not going anywhere. So the question is, how do we make it actually fun? How do I go from being a dungeon master to a fungeon master? Do you get it? But this little mini poll did teach me one thing that was really important. Players love feeling smart. That's how they've enjoyed traps, by besting them. And that kind of focused my question for getting better at traps. Could I capitalize on that feeling of being smart and beating something while also giving additional value to the experience? Could I introduce more ways for traps to be fun other than just beating them? In order to fix my traps, I had to start with maybe the most damning failure of mine: lame ass design. Part 2. Building problems. So in order to fix my lame-ass design, I had to go back to the basics. So I went to the experts on real-life traps. Department of the Army Field Manual 5-31 booby traps. So now we're primarily concerned with the introduction here, but this is an amazing resource for dungeon masters looking for real-world ideas, or for players looking to completely stuff their dungeon master's traps, or to set up amazing ambushes. You choose. FM 531 defines booby traps as an explosive charge cunningly contrived to be fired by an unsuspecting person who disturbs an apparently harmless object or performs a presumably safe act. Booby traps have a couple of pieces to them. There's the firing chain, which creates the explosion. There's the initiating action, which starts the firing chain off. And then there's any potential internal actions that happen to sort of Rube Goldberg machine the explosion into happening. So the first thing that I want to say is that this definition is a little too narrow to be perfectly useful for making fantasy dungeon traps. Explosions are not the only kind of effect that we want to have as D&D trap makers. It does give us the structure, right? Traps need bait, or a reason for the victim to set off the trap. They need a disguise, something to cover it up. They need a trigger, right? Something that actually sets it off. They need a firing chain, and they need a desired effect, which in the case of most military traps is an explosion, but in D&D, it could be a spear or a dart trap, it could be a pit trap, or any kind of magical effect, or really anything your sick little sadistic dungeon master brain can come up with. Go to town. Now, in order to accomplish creating an interesting trap, I have to put on the hat of the dungeon builder. Or the trap maker in the world and ask some questions. Who were they trying to keep out? Are they making these traps to harm or scare away intruders? Or to warn the denizens of the rest of the dungeon to the presence of intruders? Are they trying to kill the intruders? Or are they just playing with them? What are the trap maker's resources, both practically and thematically? A goblin cave won't have like a repulsing magical trap unless it was there before them, but they might have tripwires with alchemist fire or carefully curated exploding fungi. Similarly, a Lich's dungeon probably won't be shining down radiant damage onto its victims. This is also when I start thinking about how the designer intended the traps to be bypassed, or if they designed a way through. A criminal syndicate hideout will have safe paths that those in the know will be aware of so they can get through safely. But the Tome of a Dead King might have been built to never be opened again. And grasping this narrative mentality when approaching trap design leads me into part 3. Part 3, create an internal logic. This is such an important step. This is where the story of the trap comes into play. Not just the story of how we bypass the trap, but also the story of who was this trap maker? What was the dungeon made for? How does this trap work magically or mechanically? This is the part where I get to add real value to the dungeon through the experience of the trap, adding more fun and value to it other than, haha, I won. I did it. We beat it. Like, that's a good story, but there are better ones. By creating an internal logic, what I mean is that I need to figure out how the trap actually works and why it was made that way. Remember that we are in a fantasy world and you are not at all bound by your engineering knowledge or know-how for your trap design. But it's a good idea to have at least a sense of if your spear trap is spring-loaded, hydraulically powered, or maybe powered by the stolen heart of a flame elemental. Now, this internal logic, it serves partly to give you flavor as you describe the trap. As the spears shoot out of the wall, your players hear the springs creak, or the hydraulics hiss, or maybe the low thump, boom, thump, boom pound of this fire elemental's heart pulse within the wall, and a pulse of flame might like leak through the cracks in the stone. But it also allows you to inform your design. Say that you design this flame elemental powered spear trap with a pressure plate, but now that you know that it's a magical trap, maybe you decide that in fact the heart senses heartbeats within a certain area instead of using a pressure plate to trigger it. Or maybe you specify that the pressure plate causes this mechanical chain reaction to kickstart the heart. A process that your players can hear and that is so complicated it might be easier to disrupt by physical sabotage. Maybe most importantly though is the internal logic of your trap helps you improvise when players ask you questions that you have not planned for. This leads to communal world building at the table, adding a whole new fun to traps and allowing for more of the fun of beating the trap by using wits and guile. But that's all prep, and prep is only useful if it can stand on its feet in front of players. And in order to succeed at this final and most important step, I had to fix how I communicated about traps. Part 4, communication. D&D is a game about many things, but it's always played by communicating. And I was letting my stuttering communication get in the way of my players' enjoyment, partly out of fear and partly out of ignorance. I wanted desperately for both my trap to go off and my players to think that I was so smart and creative, and also for my players to bypass or disarm the trap and not feel upset at me for getting trapped. I was really at war with myself, and it led to confusion, not just for me, but for my players too. So I shifted my priority from how I was perceived to storytelling. And with that focus, I created a system for how I communicate traps to players. To begin talking about the layers of revealing and disarming a trap, let's talk about a mechanic that I find myself very often forgetting about in 5th edition. Passive perception, but also passive investigation, insight, and passive whatever the heck skill you want to apply it to. Passive perception is calculated by taking 10 and adding the character's wisdom and any proficiency or other bonuses that they might have to create your passive perception score. Mathematically, this is like the average total for the ability check with that skill, but narratively, in my game, passive perception, insight, and investigation represent how perceptive, investigative, and insightful the characters are without putting time and thought into a moment of focus on that individual skill. Now, most of the time, we are designing traps for the characters in our party. We know their stats. We know who will and who won't be able to see what with their passive skills. So do yourself a favor and make it clear in your prep who is going to be able to see the empty hallway, who is going to notice the small slits in the wall, and which maniac with the passive 18 perception will see the slight misalignment of the cobblestones, suggesting a pressure plate. And this leads me into the first layer of communicating the trap, the hook. You don't have to spell it out for your players. Based on their passive perception, or hey, active roll, if they're being careful and searching for traps by now, you need to communicate to them the clues that they see or hear, feel, or smell that may lead to them thinking that there's a trap here. Now, this is important. Don't say, oh, you see a spear trap in the wall. Say, you see a set of small, lead-lined holes about an inch wide in the right wall of this hallway, interspersed about a foot between them, all the way from the ceiling to the floor. Notice how specific that description is. Notice how it doesn't spell out what the trap is. Notice how suddenly this obstacle that could be a simple, typical problem is suddenly a mystery. We have a new kind of fun at the table. In general, I don't think it's good form to design traps that will go completely unnoticed by all of your party. That's just rude. It's just mean. And there are probably some exceptions to that rule. For example, if the barbarian and the wizard with the wisdom dump stat split off from the party, it would be completely reasonable that they would charge headlong into traps that they don't notice. But most of the time, I really believe you should give your players a hint. If your players pause and examine the situation after picking up on that hint, reward them by not setting off the trap and moving to the second layer of communicating the trap, the examination. Now, as soon as your players have said, oh, this might be a trap, we move on to this phase. The examination phase should not have any implicit risks for the characters. And if they do something that might be risky, you need to let them know. Examination can often be confused with the next phase, experimentation. And indeed, players can go back and forth between the two phases, but jumping into experimentation too quickly can lead to the stuck feeling that leaves the players bickering for way too long after they get scared. Help them slow their roll by prompting. Do you want to investigate the slits in the wall? Be careful not to tempt them into a fatal mistake here, though. You want your prompts to be helpful, not hurtful. That's going to feel like a gotcha moment, and it'll ruin their engagement and their enjoyment. The examination phase consists of examination rolls. See perception, insight, and investigation, and knowledge rolls like nature, arcana, religion, medicine, etc. I guess there's not really an etc. like in the core game, but you might have a special knowledge skill in your world that they would use for this. And it also includes specific questions that the players will ask in order to reveal more specific truths that your general rolls might not have revealed. This is super important. If a character rolls poorly on an investigation, but their player has a brilliant question that will reveal a cool clue or build out an interesting piece of the trap, allowing them to act on that cool question and get an answer is not metagaming, it's just fun. Remember that the big joy of facing traps is outwitting them. Even if a player is playing a dumb character, even the idiots among us get lucky. Or we could narratively say that the idea or the question came from a different member of the party. We're all playing together. Don't punish your players for engaging in your puzzle. At the end of the day, you don't want to actually win here. I'm getting so passionate about this because I'm totally talking to myself. That was a huge thing that I would do. Once we've examined, once we've asked our cool questions and we've made our rolls, then we move on to experimentation. And this is where risk should really come in. Experimentation is trying to gain more information about any one of the pieces or features of the trap by experimenting, usually by setting it off. Because how else are you going to gain information? How else do you experiment with a trap other than poking it with a 10-foot pole?
Come on, man!
Examination can also include the casting of information gathering spells, most notably detect magic and find traps. You guessed it. So be ready to answer questions related to these spells, or be prepared to improvise in response to others that they might cast using the internal logic that you built in one of the earlier steps. See, it's all coming together. It's all coming together. God, I could do a whole video on how I respond to detect magic. Comment if you want that. And this is a good time for me to tell you to like and subscribe if you enjoy this. If you have nothing to comment, if you don't want the detect magic video, throw your favorite emoji in the chat, because I need engagement, and be nice. It's a classy thing to do.
You stay classy, San Diego.
So remember, bait, a disguise, a trigger, a firing chain, and an effect. Any one of these could be a useful feature in disabling or avoiding the trap. Here is where your trap's internal logic really comes in, because your players are gonna mess with this trap in ways that you could never have predicted. Like everything in your game, your amazing trap will not survive its encounter with the players. Nothing survives an encounter with the players.
Oh, no.
Simple traps like a tripwire will often be set off in experimentation and can't be reset, effectively being disarmed. But it's important to note that any sound that they make will be heard by nearby creatures, which might be an intended side effect of the trap. More complex traps will have a built-in reset, which you hopefully designed as well. So once your players have experimented, and sometimes even before they've experimented, they will move on to the final phase, the attempt. The attempt will typically be an attempt to disarm, bypass, or just survive a trap. Each one of these is wildly different and has its own pitfalls and tricks for you, and obviously for them. But let's start with the simplest. Survive. An attempt to survive a trap is very often a last-ditch effort after examination and experimentation have failed, or just been non-conclusive. This is usually a bum rush through the trap, hopefully using what they learned during the earlier step to lessen or minimize the blow. The Dungeon Master Guide has a perfect example of a survival option where players use what they know about the trap to face it. Rather than simply open the chest, they prop a shield in front of it and push the chest open at a distance with an iron rod. In this case, the trap still triggers, but the hail of needles fires harmlessly into the shield. An actively not fun way of running this trap is to have them get hit by the needles anyways, as they magically find their way around the shield. If your prep literally says magic homing needles, you need to make a decision. Either change your prep and reward them for being smart, or give them advantage to resist or dodge the trap for being cautious. Now, an attempt to bypass a trap is similar, but it usually comes after the previous steps have been successful, or at least the players think they've been successful. This is often an attempt to sidestep the trigger by using abilities that the trap designer hadn't accounted for. For example, using Misty Step to pass the pressure plate, or heck, spider climbing the wall over it, or to use those abilities to disarm the trap in the way that the designer intended to use themselves. For example, Misty Stepping past to press the disarm button so that your fighter and his heavy feet can walk through easily. Or you could shoot it with an arrow if you're a really good shot, though you might break the mechanism. I'm off on a tangent. From your point of view, this only gets tricky if they're wrong, and they can be really wrong. Do you change your prep to make them right? It's always an option. The trap isn't actually set in stone, no matter what it may look like in the game. That's the easy way to make the trap fun, but consequences are important too. And as long as they don't feel like a gotcha, they can be fun. So here's what you need to ask yourself. Have you communicated clearly enough about the trap that you haven't misled them somehow? Because miscommunication is always possible, and it doesn't make you a bad dungeon master. If you think that they are misunderstanding something, especially something that their characters would understand, be sure to clarify. If they ignore you, punish them. But don't just feed them to the wolves over a misunderstanding. You can also nudge them into additional experimentations and examinations with leading questions and some good old DM manipulation. We're all familiar with that. You sure you've asked all the questions you want to ask? Yeah? Okay. No one wants to help her investigate? That gives her advantage. You know that, right? You have Detect Magic prepared, right? Oh, cool. You know you can cast that as a ritual, right? Right? If worst comes to worst and you end up gotching your players and they're upset about it, don't be afraid to ask if they'd like a mulligan. A little take-backsies is way less of a bummer than your player feeling like their agency or intention was taken away from them. Finally, disarm attempts happen when the player tries to use a tool, a spell, or something similar to break the mechanism of the trap, thereby rendering it inert. The classic examples of this are using Dispel Magic to dispel a magic trap, or using a set of Thieves tools to deactivate a mechanical one. But honestly, a lot of the structure I've built here is to avoid and bypass that boring roll of dice here, so this is how I make this fun. In order to make the dice roll, they have to have a plan to disarm the trap. If they use their Thieves tools, you have to ask them, how are they intending to disarm the trap? If they don't have anything, maybe you can come up with like a method that their character has in their back pocket that they might have done before. Maybe it's filing down runes on the edge of a lightning trap to reduce its effectiveness. Or maybe it's pounding small wooden wedges into the edges of the pressure plate so that it takes more weight to trigger. Remember that this is a storytelling game, so it kind of doesn't matter who the story comes from, as long as it makes the players smile. The goal here is to make them participate in the mystery of the trap, taking an attempt at the solution. It's also possible that they don't fully disarm the trap with one attempt. They might reduce its effectiveness, change the effect of the trap. There's a bunch of different things that could happen. Refer back to your internal logic. Dispel Magic is incredibly useful, but is also incredibly dull. So ensure that it makes sense within the rules of magic in your world. They have to see the thing to target it, so maybe they can't cast it unless they can expose the actual magical mechanism somehow. Similarly, maybe the casting only dispels half of the magical effect, keeping part of the trap still alive. Keep them guessing and problem solving. They will feel like they bested something worthy instead of just rolling a die and burning time at the table. You want to make your trap mean something. And that's it. Build it. Figure out why and how it works and communicate it clearly to your players using the hook, examination, experimentation, attempt structure. I'm really proud of that. I've been testing this method for the past couple weeks, and I've achieved some remarkable successes with it. I've both tripped traps on players who have made failed attempts at bypassing, seen them disable traps, watched them unintentionally just stuff traps by being players and doing their own thing. only to discover much later how lucky they had been. All of this has been so much fun, and it's led me to one core principle that I teased you with back at the beginning of the video. And I think that if you leave this video with only this one thing in your brain, that you'll be a better trap designer, and I will have succeeded. So listen, okay? Design your traps with an awareness that traps are an open-ended puzzle that allows your players to learn more about the world, their abilities, and the dungeon without the time crunch of combat or the social pressure of interaction. Traps are the ideal kind of play for players who struggle in other parts of the game. They can be hard to master, but they will satisfy a need your players may be looking for and haven't gotten from the game that you're running. They may not even know that they want it. By mastering this style, you will open up a whole new type of play while creating memorable moments for your players at your table. In order to illustrate how effective this style is, I'd like to share my favorite trap that I've made using this system. I call it the Tsunami Puppy Trap, or the Door Distractor. I don't know. These are working titles. Please comment with a better title. I'm struggling here. For context, this dungeon is an underwater research facility that was made by draconic mages a millennia ago, and it's been repurposed recently by a shady corporate organization. But the part of the dungeon that has this trap in it hasn't been touched by the corporation yet. So our trap maker in this case is an ancient black dragon of incredible power and means. So in this dungeon that I built in Foundry using Dungeon Draw, I have this T-shaped hallway intersection. The party is coming from the north heading south, and the hallway heads east to west. As the north-south passage leads into the T, these stairs lead down into knee-high water, under which a layer of silt has formed from centuries of erosion and decay. The west side, that's where the bait is. We have these magical shiny crystals glowing in the far room, tantalizing, teasing my treasure-hungry players. Now, the east hallway turns south after a few squares and leads to two exits. The first is an unremarkable door that leads deeper into the dungeon, but the other is this huge brass door with some faded art embossed onto it of a mountain with dragons. If they succeed on the nature check, they'll know they're white and black dragons, respectively, flying out from behind the summit. And then there's this circle that frames the art, which is covered in runes. The brass door has no handle, and there's no perceivable way to open it. And indeed, like getting your fingernails in there and pulling on it doesn't do anything. What are the parts of this trap, according to my system? The bait we talked about, it's the crystals to the west, which should tempt the players onward. The disguise. Now, the disguise is actually threefold, right? Firstly, it's the knee-deep water, which disguises the trigger because it's hard to see underwater. It's all floppy and wavy. And then it's the layer of silt, which also covers up the pressure plate. And then when you disturb silt, it makes this really thick cloud and water, making it even harder once the players have touched down or walked in. And finally, the last disguise is the brass door itself. While it's a part of the trap, it looks like bait when it's actually the trap itself. Now, the trigger is a pressure plate between the T intersection and the bait room, and it's hidden even further underneath the silt. It's triggered by 20 pounds of pressure, in addition to the water and silt being added to it. The sequence of events that leads to the trap being sprung is the pressure plate triggering a magical field that activates conjuration magic in the western bait room and opens the brass door. Now, the effect I'm really proud of. So upon triggering the trap, all characters in the east-west hallway make a strength save as the water in the bait room wells up and roars down the hallway in this tumultuous tsunami. Those who succeed manage to hold on or dive through or do some other cool thing to keep from being swept away. Those who fail are wrenched from their feet by the rushing water, and then they're dashed into the eastern wall, taking damage, and then they're carried south through the opened bronze doors, which, boom, slam shut behind them as they collapse prone onto the muddy floor of a small room. Inside this muddy, murky, mucky room is a raised, about a foot off the ground, stone circle on which a permanent magic circle spell has been cast. Wrapped inside that magic circle is a Shusuva, a hungry, angry, dirty, and ready to kill extra-planar abyssal beast.
You're dirty. Yes, you are.
So really hungry puppy with a scorpion tail. But, I mean, it could be whatever extra planner or spooky beastie that you want one or two of your players to be trapped with. Suddenly, the party is split. One half is struggling to stay alive against a creature designed to be a medium to hard challenge for the entire party, and the other half is tasked with opening an unopenable door before their friends are torn to pieces. The only written way to open the door is a lever in the corner of the muddy room, which the trapped player will have to spend time investigating instead of fighting the terrible, awful, evil beastie. I like this trap for a couple of reasons. One, it's incredibly difficult. It's a challenge. I love a challenge. The layers of disguise make it super hard to discern that there is even a trap until it's too late. So I talked earlier, though, about telegraphing the existence of traps and not surprising your players and making sure that they can see it. I can't imagine the players being able to see it without taking active checks, right? You'd have to look under the water to see the little break in the silt that would suggest this pressure plate. And you obviously can't see magic unless you're already casting Detect Magic. I telegraphed the presence of trap here, not by giving any specific clue in my description of the hallway, but by making this the literal third trap that the players had encountered in this dungeon. They were already looking for traps, so they didn't need any extra little nod. The second thing that I like about this trap is that the layers of effect in the trap and the complexity of it really tell the party a lot about the dungeon and the dungeon designer. Whatever the runes on the brass door say, and the details and the art, they could reveal incredible secrets, or even be clues to a puzzle later in the dungeon. Having a powerful interplanar creature trapped in your dungeon, it's a huge flex, and it says a lot about the means of the person or creature who created this trap. And three, I like that it has an unpredictable effect. Most traps try to simply do damage. Traps that move you somewhere or split the party, create more tactical chaos, which is a great way, by the way, to challenge overpowered or overconfident players. I also like that it moves, hurts, and traps and splits the party. It does so much with so little. Finally, I love how my players handled this, which was not at all how I expected. After talking to the little fish in the water who lay their eggs in the cracks of the floor where the pressure plate is, which is an element that I made on the spot when they asked if there were animals that they could talk to, they headed east away from my bait and towards the big brass door, and the door just fascinated them. And while they failed their arcana and history checks about the door miserably, they cast Detect Magic and discovered that the door had this powerful abjuration magic on it, and that the water, all of the water that they were now standing in, had conjuration magic on it. And they were super spooked that the water was magical.
That is magic water.
My mind is blown right now, ladies and gentlemen.
So they kind of jumped into action and they cast Dispel Magic on the door. This is a powerful mage who didn't want this door to be open and didn't want the thing inside to get out for any reason. And they decided to cast Dispel Magic on the door, which failed. But I did give it a little bit of reward for the expenditure of the spell slot. I revealed to them that the lock on the door was due to the runic circle running around the mountain. This allowed the rogue to be like, ooh, cool. Could I get out my file from my trap kit and try to file those runes away, maybe weakening the enchantment? They succeeded at the roll, and I allowed them to weaken it with the filing, and then they pried it open the rest of the way with a crowbar, allowing them to fight the beastie inside all together. They then headed east through the small door, and they spent their whole game in this completely different part of the dungeon before finally at the end, they came back, assumed they were safe, just marched down this hallway and triggered the trap completely unwittingly. Suddenly discovering, as one of their players got ripped around, slammed into the wall, and then pulled into this trap room, that they had completely outsmarted the dungeon by being players in the stupidest way. It was a wonderful way to end our game that night. Players being rewarded for being a little dumb or just chaotic is fun. So anyways, I've got this whole trap written up in PDF form on my Patreon for free. with a couple extra little traps in there as well. So go check that out and pledge if you want more content like this and you'd like to support me making these videos and making free stuff for y'all. I'm always working on more goofy, useful, and classic D&D content for y'all. So make sure you hit that little notification bell and you'll get a notification next time that I make something. Stay miles away from boredom, and I'll see you next time.